Hey folks, it's Jim. Today we're going to go over the difference between the real estate bubble in China and the real estate bubble in the US. And there are significant differences, okay? Let me open my usual disclaimer. It's not economics advice, financial advice, investment advice, or advice of any kind. Please seek out professional advice that is right for you in all your affairs. This video is for entertainment purposes only. So let's look at it. Remember way back when I did all this and I said, this was back early in 2020, I started my economics thing. And our end result was going to be 2022 or 2023, real estate bubble pop, and we were going to get back into real estate because we saw the irrational consumption of people having too much time on their hands and buying up real estate and paying way more than it was worth. But anyway, so that was our plan. Well, it may not be that good, and here's why. But let's get into the differences. Let me stay in the difference between the two bubbles. Chinese rely 70% on their wealth storage and savings in real estate. Conversely, in the US, it's only 35%. So when the bubbles pop, the wealth effect or the reverse wealth effect, which affects consumption, will be twice as bad in China as it is in the US. Okay? Just keep that in mind. And maybe not, though, because the Chinese don't consume a lot to begin with. Okay? The average Chinese person. Okay, so now the next thing is the leverage in the two markets. Okay, it's way different. Okay, in the US, we're regulated, the banking institutions, especially after 08, subprime, all that, it's no longer allowed. So the average leverage of someone buying a home is 6 times their annual income. Conversely, in China, did you know that during all this time, some of those Chinese people are borrowing 30 times their annual income? During the worst of the subprime fiasco, it never got that ridiculous. Okay, so two big differences just in the leverage in the two markets. Now, the next thing is part of China's real estate market has been revealed to be a Ponzi scheme, hasn't it? We can all see that. China was building cities that no one lived in, weren't finishing buildings, and many of them now are being taken down because they sat out so long without being finished that their skeletons were just disintegrating. So they're going to have to be bulldozed and start over. Or their real estate market's just going to correct and maybe they just build modestly from here on out. We'll see what happens, right? So that's another fact, that part of their market's a Ponzi scheme. It's way over leveraged, okay, which can't even happen in the US because of regulations, and it's about to all come to fruition. All right, so the leverage is huge, and let me give you an idea of what that leverage means. In the US, a person making $30,000 a year will have on average $180,000 mortgage. Conversely, in China, someone making $30,000 a year might have a $900,000 mortgage. Yes, crazy, isn't it? But that is true. Okay. Now, that may not be the average mortgage leverage ratio, but it appears to be at least 15x versus 6x in the US. Can you see a big difference between the two markets? Okay, it's massive. Okay, far worse than our subprime crisis. Okay, now Chinese are good savers, and they're usually financially very responsible. So we'll see how it all works out for China. But you have to admit, by looking at the numbers, there's some trouble, big trouble. Okay, and then let's look at the debt to GDP ratios of the two countries. Short, I'm going to do a video on this, explaining it deeper. But when we started this year, U.S. debt to GDP ratio was 150%. China's is right now at this moment 250%. Okay, from January 1 to now, the U.S. gross domestic product to debt ratio has fallen to 121%. Yes, almost 30% decrease in the national debt leverage. Conversely, with China, I feel by the end of this year, maybe halfway through next year, China's debt to GDP ratio will be over 300%. Wow. Okay. Talk about economic warfare, if you will. Okay. Or whatever's going on. Right. So big significant differences in just the overall economy. And why is this possibly going to happen? Because remember how much money we had to print to get through the subprime crisis in '08? Well, China's going to have to print too, and already is right now trying to stabilize those markets. So how much is China going to have to print? We'll see. I don't know. We'll see. They control everything, but we also know there's been a Ponzi scheme in there partially. We know that they've got bridges and roads to nowhere. They've got cities that have no one in them, and there's a lot else going on. So how much money is China going to have to print? I don't know. At the same time, the U.S. and many nations around the world, because of their COVID policies, have been pulling their manufacturing out of China. So what's happening to their GDP? It's possibly going to shrink, just like ours did when we went into that massive recession back in '08, right? So if their debt is climbing and their GDP is shrinking, ooh, that debt to GDP ratio might not come out so good by the end of the year. Okay, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, now the other thing that's significantly different, China's going to print to get through this. Whereas the US, all of our big banks, BlackRock, Blackstone, Citibank, Wells Fargo, B of A, even Warren Buffett's compiling cash, okay? And then you know me, I went to 95% cash because our end game was real estate. Well, they have a real estate chest right now, just put together like 6 of the big banks of $100 billion to backstop the real estate market. It is designated for real estate, sitting in cash, waiting to buy up the excess real estate. Okay, remember, and that may play into Klaus Schwab's, you will own nothing and be happy. Okay, so if they buy it back up and start renting it back up, that's renting it out to people. That fits Klaus Schwab's narrative, doesn't it? So, and it's the wealth transfer of wealth again, isn't it? When, you know, people ran in buying up overpriced real estate. They got no one to blame but themselves. Okay, so I'm not going to feel sorry for anybody. You know, do your homework, do your research before you make any big purchase. Check everything, and no one understands. And obviously, many people did, because add to their $100 billion in their war chest waiting to buy back excess real estate. Then you get to people like me who've been planning for this. All of us combined have another $100 billion. So that's $200 billion. The Fed doesn't have to print a penny. Conversely, China is already printing to get through this. Okay, so that's another big difference. The dollar strength is probably going to continue through this because our debt to GDP ratio is falling, not rising. Yes. And I'm going to do a separate video on that as to why this is happening. And it may be 100% debt to GDP ratio, which means pretty much even. And that makes us one of the most financially solid nations on the planet. Okay. And for all the big nations, it will make us for sure that way. Okay. So I wanted to get this video out. There are extremely different housing market bubbles popping. China's is more like our '08 subprime crisis, whereas the US has strictly controlled lending leverage here. So we're not going to have that crisis. That's why I don't think the housing market's going to tumble like people think it does. It will. And also, there's $200 billion in cash right now waiting to backstop it. Powell's not going to print a penny through this thing. Okay. And on top of all of that, our GDP is growing during this time. Now, if we go into a global recession, I don't know. We are 1 million employees short of the labor needs in the US right now because of so much manufacturing coming home. And I know that a lot of you watch different channels and all that and aren't seeing this because it's not news. Good news doesn't sell tickets, okay? And what's his name? The Canadian prepper, he's told everybody that. He does fear porn. Why? Because we watch it, okay? And he gets twice as many views for a fear porn as he does a good video, okay? So I know things seem crazy in the world, folks. But the evil overlords, the global elites that control us in Europe, the UK, and the Western civilizations, right? Those people are the big corporations, okay? And so that's why they can lay off 20,000 people. They're just sitting in there anyway, employed, they can decide to employ or unemploy depending on the economic needs of the country. So you're going to see a lot more layoffs coming up from companies that just are carrying dead weight. Okay, so that they can start transferring all that employee power to the places that we need it. Okay, so nothing is what it appears right now from the Western perspective. A lot has been concealed. A lot has been a deception to Ping and Putin to make the moves they've made, to follow their arrogance, to stroke their own egos. There's a whole lot going on, folks. And if you can see through all of the BS and stay away from the fear porn, we've made money the whole way through this, haven't we? We 2.5 years ago, we knew real estate was going to correct, didn't we? And we were preparing for it. So you think the big banks haven't? You think Powell hasn't? You think the world hasn't? Or the West? Let me say the West, okay? So even, I know I'll do a video to try and alleviate a lot of fears in a lot of areas as I can do them. But just be aware of that. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is falling while China's will keep increasing. Okay, so there's extremely different bubbles popping right now. Okay, and I don't even think what we're going to see is a bubble pop. However, manufactured housing, I think, will be a great mobile homes. If I were needing to get out of renting and all that, wanted to be free, I would find a mobile home on a piece of land with a well, and I would pay cash for it, had you follow my plan, and get it as dirt cheap as possible. And I think that market is going to come down significant. People way overpaid for manufactured housing, and the loan criteria is much different in that market. So I think there is going to be a semi-crisis in that market, but it's a lot smaller. So if I were wanting to be free, that's what I would be looking at doing this cycle. And I'm doing it in Wisconsin. I'm buying a place in Wisconsin this year. So I have a place closer to my grandson, and I'm decided I'm buying a manufactured home. And I don't care what shape it's in. If I get the land and the well and the septic and all of that, I don't care, because they're so cheap to rebuild, right? It's all cosmetics. So that I'm already planning to do that just so I have a another place closer to my grandson. But, you make the decisions that are right for you. I never give advice, but I believe that is one market that's going to have extremely good value as we go through this. Extremely good, because the banks may be forced to clear their books on this stuff. Okay. So, and I don't know that all the big banks are going to want to get back into manufactured housing again. But if you've saved the cash, we may be able to offer the bank extremely low and get a dirt cheap place that leads to freedom from rent, freedom from mortgage. All of that has lower property taxes, everything. It's a win. I think manufactured housing is going to be the best sector going forward. We're looking for freedom. We want our own water. We want to grow our own food. We don't want to pay rent or mortgage, all of that, right? So, if our ego's in what we live in, well, I don't know. If our ego's in much of our consumption, we're probably going to wind up broke anyway. So I would be looking at the manufactured housing sector as a potential for a steal, like buying the land and for land value and getting a free mobile home that you may have to work on a little bit. But wow, if I can eliminate rent and mortgage, that's an extreme advantage, isn't it? So I think that's one market that will have some really good buys in it. Maybe not, perfect, but some really good buys. I think it's going to drop much farther than the stick-built housing market. There's just too many people waiting to buy a house. Okay, too much cash on the sidelines. $16 trillion of cash on the sidelines right now from investors and banks and all of that. I went to cash, remember? Now there's 16 trillion sitting on the sidelines out of this market because you can see what's coming, right? Hope you're all doing well. Hope life's treating you good. Try not to watch a lot of fear porn. Stay into what's important for yourself, okay? Hope you're all doing well. Jim out.